Hi, it's Cheeky Devil with true stories about care facilities from people telling them after the BURTON-on-TRENT Ghost Walk. I hope you enjoyed them. The General Hospital by Mavis. I started working at the General Hospital when I first qualified as a nurse. It was quite an old hospital. It started life nearly 100 years before and was built very much in the style of that era, being a very large 4-storey building made of red brick with very dark and gloomy corridors, devoid of any colour on the floors and walls, which once would have been clinically white but had faded over the years into an off-brown colour. My ward was Ward 5, which unfortunately for me was at the top of the hospital on the 4th floor and could only be accessed by a large antique lift or by walking up 4 flights of stairs. The ward's layout, although having modern equipment, was set out in the same design as 100 years before. The beds were set out in what they call Nightingale fashion, which was basically straight lines on either side of the room, left and right, and in between the beds were curtains to close round the bed areas. Behind these were 4 separate isolation rooms, and in the middle of the room there was a walkway, and in between the beds it was like stepping back in time. I worked my first 6 months on the ward on days to support me in my new post. Later though, I was sent on nights. My nights for the first couple of weeks were uneventful until one night. I was doing the drug round as usual on the ward, and one of the ladies in my care had cancer and had been given a short time to live. Due to this, she was on regular pain relief. As usual, I offered the lady her pain relief, but I can still hear her words now. "Thank you, dear. There is no need. The lady in white has already given them to me, and I now feel wonderful." I asked the lady if she was sure about that, and she insisted she had been given to her. I was concerned because none of the staff wore white, and no medical staff or qualified people were on the ward. I just put it down to a fluke or the lady's imagination. Another lady I offered a drink to at the end of my drug round replied, "Nope, you're okay. The lady in white has offered me one." This time, this rattled me, and I searched the ward for this lady, but with no luck. As I mentioned earlier, the beds were in straight lines on the ward, but there were 4 side rooms, and these were used for people who were, well, very close to death. And they had in a lot of cases heart monitors which alarmed the heart stop and were connected to the emergency crash team for immediate medical attention. There was also other medical equipment in the room, i.e. oxygen, etc. The doors to these rooms had clear glass round portal windows, the kind of things you would get on a ship. Part of my round was to check these rooms, and when I got to room 4 it was my last check at the end of my round. I looked through the window and the patient was sitting up in bed staring at space at the end of her bed. I blinked my eye and in the space that she was staring at a small speck of light appeared the size of a pea. Within a couple of seconds the light grew into an orb and there was a brilliant white light, but in the light etched in black was the shape of a figure. Then suddenly, stepping out of the white light was the figure of an old woman. I couldn't see what clothing she was wearing, just the bright light, but I could see her face. She was very old, in fact ancient. She had a leather-like but pale skin, and once where wrinkles were, now were grooves, and her teeth were broken, and the majority of them were black. But it was her eyes. I always remember them most, her eyes. They were jet black and piercing. For a split second, she moved her head and stared at me. I was frozen to the spot in sheer terror, but was in a strange way quite mesmerised. Then she turned her head away and stood at the end of her bed, looking directly at the patient, and crooked her middle finger and started to gesture her to come with her. Then as soon as she had appeared, she disappeared. I was in a trance, which was awoken by an alarm going off. Quickly realised that it was the alarm going off on the patient's monitor. She was flatlining, her heart had stopped beating. I ran to get the emergency trolley, but by the time myself and the emergency team got to her, she had died. I resigned my job the next day, but I later heard that the other 2 women who had seen the white lady also died shortly after. The hospital closed in 1993, but I believe it is now a housing estate. The Estate by Pamela. I bought my flat when my husband passed away. It wasn't over large, but it was big enough for me and my dog Sally. Nothing paranormal happened until one terrifying day and night. It was a hot July day. I'd come inside out of the heat and was sitting in my lounge and was watching TV. And then for no apparent reason my lounge door suddenly flung open and volumes started to whoosh back and forth, increasing with great speed at the same time. The temperature dropped in the room and I could see my breath in front of me. Sally, who was a small poodle, backed away from the door and started to bark erratically at it. Then it all stopped, but Sally kept barking at something on the other side of the door. I was absolutely terrified. I eventually plucked up the courage to go up to the doors and look into my corridor. I could see nothing there. As I strained my eyes, though, I started to focus across my corridor into the kitchen area on the other side. And then I saw it, a hand, but not a normal hand. It was translucent. I could see straight through it. But then in a split second, as out of thin air, There was a figure of a man. His attire was strange. What I remember about him was bright pink shirt and red braces, and then as quickly as he appeared, he disappeared. I spent the rest of the day anxious and worried after seeing the man in the kitchen, and I steeled myself and went to bed. I drifted off to sleep, which seemed like a couple of hours, and I woke up with a feeling of being watched, and I was not wrong. Surrounding me around my bed were figures, but not human ones, because I could see straight through them, and they were obviously talking about me. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but it was obviously what profession they were in, by the clothing they were wearing. The men had long white coats on, and the females had nursing uniforms on. This time I did get under my covers and did not come out to daylight next day, and I looked around the room and nobody was there. I found out later the flats were built on the grounds of the old hospital, and mine was built where the morgue was. The apparitions had not only been seen by me in my flat, but my neighbours as well, especially the man with the purple braces, who the story had it was a phlebotomist who killed several people by poisoning them, and then killed himself and haunted the hospital. The Nursing Home by Frida. I worked as a nurse in an elderly home. The home was set in a rural location set off a road in its own grounds, with gardens and a large pond at the front of the house. It was, I would say, around 300 years old, was quite an imposing sight, having white walls and black beams on the exterior, but was modern inside, being set out over 3 floors, a ground, a middle and an attic. It had around 20 plus bedrooms for residents, and was said to be one of 2 original halls, one being the upper and this one being the lower hall. I actually took a job here as a night nurse and was part of a team of 3 people, myself and 2 care assistants. From the onset, things at this place did not seem right. Although at times you worked on your own, you never felt so, as you felt as someone or something was watching you. For no reason, temperatures would drop. They were that cold you could see your breath in front of you. What was also bizarre was that items would go missing, and when the residents were asleep, and then reappear in other part of the home. At first I thought it was the staff moving items around and just generally playing tricks on me. The home though was very large, and the 2 care assistants would work in another part of the home, as I tended to be on my own while I did my drug round and nursing duties. My routine was quite a regular one, following the same route as I did the drug round, and I got to know my residents quite well, and also the layout of the home, and in particular the residents' room and the contents in them. I've got to admit there was one resident called Ethel who I became somewhat fond of. Ethel had quite a pleasant room with the usual things in it, pictures of relatives and various knickknacks from her life. One thing that she had though, which was different, the only one in the home, was that she had sitting on her bed a very large black and white teddy bear which was called Mr. Burroughs. I gave Ethel her tablets and left the room, proceeded down a long corridor which ran around a bend, where a large chair was sited, and as I went around the bend, the chair was sited in its usual place, but I nearly pushed the drug trolley over in shock. Sitting in the chair, staring at me, was the same Mr. Burroughs. When I got over the initial shock and pulled myself together, I made my way back down the corridor, checking as I went that I was the only person in this part of the building, and I checked on Ethel, who was fast asleep. One of the things about Ethel was that she was bedbound, so for her to place the bear up the corridor within 4 minutes and suddenly have a miracle and be able to walk down the corridor and then get past me without being noticed was, well, impossible. Although shaken, I placed Mr. Burroughs back in her room and continued with my duties, not saying a word about it to anyone. The events that followed, though, gave me some insight into what was going on. To be honest, after this incident I did not want to go back to the home, but to be honest, I needed the money. I wish I had never bothered. The incidents of items around the home, items disappearing and reappearing, seemed to increase as it's like they were being ramped up. I carried on, though, blocking it out of my mind and thinking of the paycheck. One night, though, when I was doing the drug round, I was standing near the door to the attic, and the temperature suddenly dropped, and a silhouette of what could have been a woman in a white glow with no facial features, and I always remember no legs, glided down the corridor and down the stairs. When I stopped myself from having a heart attack, I noticed that the door to the attic was opened. I was sure this had been locked prior to the apparition, and it seemed that the door, where it had been open, inviting me in. Call it stupidity or curiosity, I locked my drug trolley up and opened the door. Inside was a long, winding staircase, and with much against my common sense I proceeded to go up. At the top of the staircase was another door, and with some hesitancy and much fear I opened the door, and in front of me was an empty room, except for a low metal bed and a stained old mattress on it. What was scary, though, was what was attached to the bed. There were 2 metal cuffs attached to it on chains. On the inside of the door there were scratch marks, This was enough. I slammed the door and ran down the stairs. I managed to finish my drug round and got to the end of my shift and left and never went back. Several years later I was speaking to former workers of the home and I casually asked if anybody knew of the room in the attic. They explained around 200 years ago the squire got a local girl pregnant, but she threatened to run away, so he got her and locked her in the attic and shackled her to the bed, but she escaped and drowned herself in the pond, still pregnant with her baby. Her name was Ethel. The man who got her pregnant was Mr. Burroughs. Was Ethel trying to tell me something from the grave? Hope you enjoyed these stories, and please hit the subscribe and that notification button and give us a like below. And if you want to find out more about the ghost walks, check out the website on the address above.